Yes, hello. This is Dr. Lemmon, and this is part of my Q&A playlist. What I've been doing on my Q&A playlist for most part is just answering questions. People send me emails of questions, and I just answer them. I learned a long time ago that I had concepts and ideas I kind of played with, but when I started a center and people started coming in, they really didn't want to know a big picture. They didn't want to know somebody's story. They didn't need to have a new concept, a new religion, a new ideology. That's nothing what they wanted. They really want to know, hey, what can I do to change the way my life is? Really looking at what influences me and what can I do about it? And how can I fix it? How can I make it better? How can I influence other people? How can I make those kind of changes? So that was the questions I got. And that was been the nature of my work ever since then. So I taught and had a center for years. I had staff, I have teachers, they're still out there, they're still teaching. It's not because I was the wizard, right? The wizard was just a terminology that I used for a blog site. So it just simply was that I had asked those questions and I had then spent my life researching those questions. I've never owned a television. It's just simply, I read books, I looked things up. I would get one person's view and I said, well, that's interesting. Then I look at another person's view and that's interesting. And I never found, never did I find the answer. I don't know the answer. That's the good news. I don't know the answer. So all those things are a great resource because they open up doorways to look bigger and get bigger, right? That's the idea, expand it out. But when you teach it in little bits and pieces, it's a little confusing. People get a couple of classes, they take a class, they take an idea, they listen to a talk, and then they have a lot of questions. It's confusing sometimes. So I did have a very dear friend who has now passed, but about a year ago or so, he said to me, one of your trips that you come through here, Chris, I want to sit down and spend a day with you and get the big picture because I've learned all these things and I do these things and they're all working pretty good. And I can't get them together. He was a very bright person and kind of in the science field. So, he was very logical, and some of the stuff is a little not so logical, right? It's like, all right, so let me throw this out. I kind of grew up in the 40s and it was kind of like, I didn't see people behaving in a very logical sort of way for a very logical world. I saw people doing things I couldn't figure out why, right? Yes, it was a post-war. There were homeless camps all over the place because people had got back and there was no housing and blah, blah, blah. So things were however they were, right? And it's just, I was looking around trying to make sense of it. My family would say, oh, when you go to school, you'll learn, because I was like 6 asking these questions and 7. But I didn't see that as true because I saw adults all over the place and they were doing a lot of crazy stuff too. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Maybe I was just a little too impatient. I'm still a little too impatient. But most certainly I just had a lot of questions and I've always had questions. So that was the start of me looking at things and then seeing things that could not be explained in a logical sort and then see things that could be explained in a logical sort of way. Or finally arriving. I can remember my grandmother panicking because I tore her sewing machine apart, trying to figure out how it worked when I was 7. So it's like, I got it all back together and it worked fine. It was one of those pedal type, no motor on it. It's like, but I wanted to know how I got that thread inside. So anyway, curious questions, which drove me eventually when I got to college to go into engineering because I thought that was the answer to the questions. And I guess it was the answer to logical questions, but it didn't touch on the other aspects of life. So I switched to psychology. So there's my background in a nutshell. Big picture was just a bunch of questions, right? I would watch people and I'd say, why'd they do that? Or I would do something and say, why'd I do that? Right? So it's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. I've always think in terms of what influenced me or how did I influence them and how did that work? So let's take a look at that. This is going to be a rather long one. So to my dear friend who has passed, this is an honor of you, Doug, kind of a big picture, right? And it'll probably be in parts because I'm gonna talk for a little bit. I could talk forever, but I'm gonna talk for a little bit and then close this one out and make it a part 2 and a part 3 and a part 4 or whatever it takes to throw all these ideas together, right? So the first thing I start to look at, let me take it apart a little bit. Let's start to talk about thinking. thinking is interesting, right? So this is kind of, all the focus on this is going to be kind of about the logical world. We're not going to get into uh, angels and demons and all this other crazy stuff, right? Or any religious concepts, just kind of the logical world. So I'm really looking at, starting out with looking at thinking. What is the matrix of it, right? So I was really curious about that for a long time with a kid, because I'd found that certain things I could do really well, certain things I couldn't do very well, and certain things I didn't quite understand. I remember when they introduced spelling bees, I watched at first, as a first grader, they would get up and spell these words and they would get stressed out and they would be up and go another round, another round, another round, and finally whittled down to a winner, right? And I'd watch that whole thing and I said, why would someone go through that to win? I mean, what do you get when you win? I won the spelling bee. I mean, I didn't understand that. So when I was put into my first spelling bee, I just got up and said, I don't know how to spell it. Whatever the word was, I didn't care. And they sat me down and I didn't have to do anything else. I was out of it. So the first thing I can remember learning in school was how to disassociate, to step out of. I didn't want the accolades of winning. I wanted to know what drove them to do that. Why was it important to win? What was in it for them? That was my question. And so I just sat back there, looked at comic books or something, and every now and then looked at them and watched them stress and sweat and worry about the word and think about it. And I'm going to spend hours rehearsing and like, wow, that's really kind of interesting. I never felt compelled to do things right. I've always learned more when I screw it up. So I go, oh, okay, well, that's kind of cool. I learned more. So that's kind of neat. I've done things, I've fixed them up. They came out okay. People said, well, that's really amazing. I think, well, okay, whatever. I'm still not interested in winning. All right. So that's where my start. So as I got more and more into thinking, yes, today we understand it's patterns, blah, blah, blah. It's all patterns because this is a logical structured world. Everything is patterns. The air you breathe is patterns. Everything. Look at the atomic table. There's very, very little differences. Just a mathematical one account. Very little differences between all those elements, but in appearance, they're much uniquely different, right? But on a scale, they're not very different. And some of those elements don't even exist on Earth. So it's like, wow, that's really kind of interesting. All logical pieces, all packaged. So it's like, wow, we should be able to map ourselves around there. I know for a long time the thought was that there should be some universal mapping, some connect to the dots in the center of everything, because, you know, with one source, one blah, 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 then it all should be all connected, right? But it doesn't appear to be necessarily that way. It's all really intricate and it plays off of each other. I would have to say, rather than one idea, one source, one thing that unifies it all, I think that we have instead is we have an amazing network of communication, a network of ideas that all work off of each other. That's kind of where I arrived at. I'm not saying that's the truth. I'm saying that's what's in my head, right? So, you know, I'm not advocating that you think as I do. Most certainly, you'd probably lose a lot of hair. I'm just advocating that you find your own answers. But to do that, you have to pursue questions, right? That's what I'm saying. Okay. So I look at thinking, I say, okay, it's all patterns. It's really kind of interesting. We see all this networking going on with logical sequences, running patterns, and maybe a particular firing pattern engages in different aspects of your brain into different things and blah, 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 blah. And they come up with all those answers by watching blood flow on a fMRI, right? And they go, well, they're assuming that if blood flows to a certain part of the brain, then the brain's working. And so it needs fuel. And so therefore that part is engaged somehow, way, shape, or form. It's a good assumption. I don't have a problem with that, but it is just what it is, right? So thinking is an interesting thing. It does appear to be all patterns. We got then into transformational linguistics and other ideas that come out that really starts to say that we, interactive piece, is all really patterns too. The way I talk to you, the way we interact, the way we pick who our friends are and who our friends are not, all those things seem to be more driven by pattern than choice. It seems to be a really strong pattern orchestrated world. And as we start to recognize that we only have 7 plus or minus 2 conscious to play with, why, it must be mostly all pattern orchestrated work. For a long time, we thought it was a stimulus response. In other words, a stimulus would come in and we would search for a database and then respond. But now today, we know that's not enough time for that. So things operate a little differently. So we have gained some insights. I've been on the planet for a while. If I lived another 100 years, I might be able to make a video and say, this is what I know. But right now, it's not what I really know. It's just what I'm observing. So thinking is pretty much all patterns. The whole thing is patterns and structures. We don't notice it that way. The reason we don't notice it that way is we just put together stories which are simply that we can share and network with. And I can say, how was my vacation? I just spent 2 months somewhere and I can tell you in 15 minutes how my vacation was. It's the way that we communicate, right? Because remember, we used to go on a trip and share pictures with people and you show them your 20 pictures. Now I go on a trip and I've got 3,000 pictures and nobody wants to sit and look at 3,000 pictures. So I really got them on a drive somewhere. And I'm thinking, well, I don't even know what I would do with these pictures. They really have no value to me. I got a camera and started taking pictures because I walk fast, I move fast, and everybody was upset because I would always be ahead of them. So I got a camera. That slowed me down. I'd stop and take a picture. I'd stop and take a picture. I'd stop and take a picture. It allowed me to pace for the rest of the crowd. That's the way my thinking goes. So I could keep pace with them. Then the negative effect of it is I've got all these pictures. I have no idea what to do with. All right. So that's the piece called thinking, just pattern pieces. Somehow or another, we put this all together. So my first question then is, where's memory? Where do we put this? I mean, it's nice to say that we all put this in our head, but they don't necessarily see that as being that way. It's processed here, but not necessarily stored there. So is it stored in bone marrow? Maybe. Some stuff appears to be, maybe. We don't know, right? Really kind of intriguing. Let's track down memory lane and see where that takes us, right? So what we do know is we can take an earthworm, they got a really small brain, and we can take an earthworm and we can teach it a trick. We abuse it a little bit, but we most certainly teach it to make some shortcuts. It wants to avoid pain, so it pretty much plays a game, and we can teach it to do something. And what's really interesting, once we teach this earthworm to do something, we can take that little rascal and cut them up to pieces. And then we can feed them to small new worms. And then we throw the new worms in the arena and they learn the trick from eating him. Wow, that's cool. Where's that memory go? Or we can take mice and we can teach a mouse to run a maze. And then we take a little fluid out of his brain. You know, it's not just random. It needs a couple of variables in it, but most certainly we just take some out and we can eject it into a couple of little baby mice and we can then throw them in there and they can run a maze. Wow, where's learning at? It's kind of interesting, right? So maybe we should just go to school and eat our teacher instead of read the books. I'm not all that sure. I mean, that's a crazy answer, but you start to see it's like, where's that stored at? Where is that? There was a researcher, I think in Italy quite a few years ago, that was trying to work with memory and water. He got a published paper, but you know, they just kind of like, it never went anywhere, right? So and he finally died. Then there's another researcher that knew him. He kind of admired his work, but didn't get involved because it wasn't going to go anywhere, right? In other words, it wasn't funded, wasn't making anybody any money. So there was no way to make any profit off of it. But this second researcher, I'm not throwing out names and this is not a science paper. So I'm going to keep it just abstract, right? So this researcher actually won a prize because he was the guy that identified HIV virus, made him famous, right? And made him some money. And so at that point, he had some autonomy. He could go do whatever he wanted to do. And he didn't need the money and he didn't need the fame. So he picked up on this other guy's work. Now, I'm going to give you the short circuit version of what he did, which I think is kind of interesting. He took some purified water. I mean, they go through great lengths to purify this water. They run through filters, they run it through all kinds of, they take all the polarity out of it, they take the charge off of it. This is absolutely pure. You put on an electronic microscope, there's nothing in it but hydrogen and oxygen, period. That's it. Totally pure, right? So they get purified water they use in the labs. And in that purified water, he drops, because he still has a bunch of samples left from his identifying HIV. He takes some DNA from a virus, identifiable, mapped, so they can read it, right? So he takes a couple of DNA chains from a virus and drops in this purified water. A few, not very many, just a couple. And then he shakes it all up really good. And then he makes a cutting like you do in homeopathic. He takes 3% of that bottle of water and then mixes more purified water in with that 3%. And he does 24 cuts like that. And then he goes and looks at it, and there's no particles in there. Nothing shows up in there. Nothing at all. So he shakes that all up really good. Then he takes a few drops out of there and he puts it in a container and he lays it on top of a microphone. It's a microphone that's really, really sensitive to any type of electrical impulses of any sort. Very, very sensitive, right? So he lays it on top of that and he hooks this microphone up into a computer. And he lets it sit there for about an hour on top of this mic. And then he takes that, he's created a file of whatever that mic picked up in that hour. And then he takes that file and he emails it to another scientist in a different country. And the other scientist in a different country gets that message on his computer. And then what he does, he plugs into that and he gets a coil, like a speaker coil, and he takes another beaker of purified water, same technology, puts it in the center of this coil and leaves this impulse, this message, run through that coil for an hour. And then he takes that out and he examines it and he drops just some protein, isolated proteins. The isolated proteins, he drops them in there and he watches, and those proteins form the chain, the DNA code for the virus that the guy had tested it in. So, wow, that's pretty interesting. Where did that message get transferred in all of that filtration process? I don't know. So much for logical systems. Now it sits and waits for someone else to come along and do the experiment again and see if they can then put their heads together and figure out what causes it. It's kind of intriguing. So what I'm telling you is we don't know. We don't know. So what I learned as a kid was that when people told me when I get to school, I'd learn and I'd know. And now here I am many, many years later and many, many books in my library read, and I still don't know. So I like that. I like the fact that we can live in a logical world where everything's predictable and we don't know. That makes me feel good because it has potential and influence, and that's really what I'm looking for. All right. So memory is kind of an unknown thing. We can tell stories about it. People write books about it, but it's just all assessments. You have to understand that when you look at a result, they say it's appreciable or it's significant. What significant means when you run a test. They run a test and they say, mathematically, if we did this, randomness would produce these results. If I get results more than random, then that tells me that there's a significant something going on. Significant can be really small. Careful with science. It's not necessarily big. It can be really small. So it just means that it's more than random. We do the test several times, and at some point, if it was just random, it should bounce somewhere around that middle point. And if it's always more than the middle point, that means there's a significant influence. Remember, my theme is looking for influences, right? So that's what I'm curious about. So when we start to look at the nature of what affects us, I think the effect gets showed up into what we call states of being. People get in different states. They get happy, they get mad, they get frustrated, they get whatever. You can call that moods. You can call that temperament. You can call that whatever you want to call it, right? It don't matter, but it most certainly exists in people. We can see that. We can see somebody switch We can see them really happy driving down the road, and all of a sudden you come around a corner, there's traffic, and then you watch their whole mood change, right? What are those temperaments? What's that mood? What's creating that whole package, right? Been tons of research done on that, right? We look at that element of something that shows up, maybe from on that mysterious memory. I'm not sure what, right? So the premise is that we come in to this planet not really having a very good idea of, we didn't have a manual. We can't even read it because we can't see it first. So we come in and we start a learning curve of trying to figure out. We learn really fast. I think children learn, they say an average of 90 words, no, 90. Yeah. I think like every hour and a half, they learn a new word in use. It's unbelievable expectations of what they can learn with that power learning piece that they come into. So I don't remember the exact numbers on it, but it's huge, right? We used to think that the children were born with a blank slate. Now we're really kind of confused on it because they seem to have preferences even at the moment of birth. Experiments that were done. One I can remember was the pillow song. While mom was pregnant, they had a pillow with a mic in it. So they were playing that on her belly, but at the same time they had earphones on her. And so mom was listening to one song and the baby was hearing another one. And then after the baby is born, it seemed to respond to the song it was hearing in preference to the song that mom was hearing. So there's obviously, when you're born, the minute you're born, you've already had 9 months of training, or at least some of that in training. So, and we know that it continues because we continue to learn, right? This whole thing develops a long ways outside post-birth. So this whole dynamic of learning and picking up things and processing things and learning to put them together. I love Piaget's series of books. They're a little challenge to read because of the logical system that he put together, but most certainly it's very enlightening when you start to see those patterns and how we learn and how we, at what age we start to put formal logic together and we start to figure things out. Really, really kind of intriguing, and how we deny the stages that we just went through. It's almost as if we have wiped out the memory from those stages and we now apply everything to the new stage. So we really have a feature of updating that comes into play. And that may give you some clue to why the moods and the temperaments. In other words, there's a flood of energy that comes in, maybe to wipe out old files and put a new file on top of it. I don't know, it's just a wild guess, right? So this is kind of, we start to look at this ability to process, to move forward, to expand this out, which I call expanding that into range, right? Expand it out so we have a bigger view and a bigger view and a bigger view and a bigger view. You have to remember that the whole logical world is a range. It is established by Planck's constant, right? So anything smaller than Planck's constant, the smallest piece, we can't see, perceive, talk about, measure, do anything to. It's out of our range. And anything larger than Planck's constant, we have the same problem with. So we're kind of in a range, right? Now, the average person can't see end to end on that range, but most certainly in our testing, we start to realize there's the parameter for the range. So intriguing. So each of us have a multitude of ranges that we go through. We're watching a movie, we're looking at a screen, and that's a particular range. If we're at Thanksgiving dinner, maybe we need to be able to see what's at the other end of the table if we're going to be dining, right? So those are different ranges that we have. And different ranges, sometimes when they shift, have effects on different moods. So obviously there's a lot of data that's associated. Once again, that associated data is stored in some memory, wherever memory's at, which we don't know, right? Kind of intriguing. And we're going to do all this stuff. We need to have an endpoint. We need to have a logical piece. If I'm going to build a structure, I have to have a starting point, right? It's like, so we take a surveyor out and the surveyor maps out the house. I get a permit. I find out the code. I have to then find out where the house has to be positioned, how much easement has to be in the front, back, side. I have to have a starting point to produce a square to be able to build it so it doesn't fall down. So we need to have something to secure into, that we need to secure into something. So most of it's just simply secure into the environment that's around us, right? I just said, I'm going to build a house on a piece of land. I buy a piece of land and I could build a house on it, right? If in some states I can just go out and build a house on a piece of land, level it out a little bit and put my foundation in and build it. In other states, I have to do samples of ground. I have to kind of dig down a ways. So different states have different laws to kind of keep it safe and keep houses from falling over, and other craziness has occurred, right? So you have to have a plan. You have to have a structure to put this together. So everything is secured into a point of reference, and then everything pairs off of those point of reference. Those are what we secure into. Most of the time, what we secure into is something that's out there in the ambient. We test something out there in our environment. I turn to my street on the way home and I see my trees out in front, the maple trees, and I'm going, oh, there's my house. And then I see the mailbox out there and I can whip in the driveway and I'm home, right? So that's those elements I secure into. And that seems to work pretty good. We go back in life and we look at some place when we were a kid, and it may look disproportional to when it was when you were a kid, of course, different size, but most certainly it's familiar, right? Yeah, at times. And then at other times, not familiar, because sometimes things get demolished. Sometimes things change. Maybe your town collapsed. Maybe a volcano took it out, or a forest fire. And you're never going to see that village or that scene or that again, but you still have a piece of that in memory. So we then go back in the archives and files and pictures, and we find that our memory is really not that accurate either, because memory seems to be, wherever it's stored, it seems to be stored in some kind of a shorthand, once again, in a pattern or a code. So maybe we thought Grandma's house was white and Aunt Betty's house was white, and then we find out that really neither one were white. Like, oh, okay. Because we just have some details, and the rest we change every time we think of it. And there's been lots of science behind the fact that you recall a memory and then you recall it again and they interview you, you recall it again, they interview you, and it changes. And what gets to be fun is they can seed someone in a group with a story that will affect your memory. And that's been researched. So influence is probably bigger than what we thought it was. Really intriguing. So to me, the heart of everything is finding the influence pieces, okay? So the stability normally is put into the background. Right now in a time of change, climate change, weather change, history, rewriting our history right now because we don't like the way it was. And we have a whole bunch of people that grew up. I grew up going outside, having freedom. As a kid, I could easily walk a mile and a half downtown as a 6-year-old and walk a mile and a half back. Took me all day, but I'd just go explore. Not so with kids today. Pretty much they grow up in front of that television set. I never had a television set, so I never got to do that, right? I got lost in a few books, but never got a television. So their assessment of the world is very different. They're looking at a view that, the good news is they're looking at a view I never got to see because I was a kid in a little town and that's what I got to see. I thought they were all crazy. When we moved out of that town, I thought things would be better. And we got to a different town in a different state and they were just as crazy as the other ones. So it's like, so it really did. It was different, but it was just as strange. So not necessarily does it make a whole lot of sense. It's something that develops over time. We are now accepting things that other people just kind of entertained. Like I told you, the story of memory. Maybe someday we'll realize that there is kind of some type of electronic pulse that could stay in the molecules of water some way, shape, or form. I don't know. It's far-fetched as far as I'm concerned, but it sounds good. I'd go for it. So this is what's happened as things progress, as we move forward, we start to understand more of this stuff. We start to have an idea about it. We then have a tendency to be able to build a story around it, and all the blind spots, we build blocks in a way not to see the blind spots. So the story, the bias, starts to build with more and more data, starts to look stronger, and it's kind of hard to see the holes in the bottom, right? When we start to, the story starts to fill the gap in. So it's not, so it's far more believable, but there's still gaps in it. Like I said, that significant doesn't mean that it's 100%. It just means it's more than random. So science gives us significant pieces, more than random pieces. I love reading science books, but you know, it's just ideas. That's all it is. All right. So normally we secure into the environment around it. The environment changes. I move. I've got to change the way I secure into. If I live someplace else, I got to change. If I go on a trip, I most certainly have to make some changes. I go on a trip, I change hotels every 2 days. It's pretty much every 2 days. I got to look around a little bit and determine if this taxi's actually taking me to my hotel or not. So we learn to then build a bigger range as we start to lose some of our securing elements, but we have to find some type of grounding to get into to connect us as a starting point to build forward. Always, as we build ideas, even if it's in a story, we need to connect those up, connect those pieces up, bring them together, build forward. What I've learned in life is these stories up here in our head, since they're pretty well fabricated, we tell stories over and over again. We change them every time. Like I said, we change the memory every time. So there's a lot of fabrication. It's all in the shorthand, somewhere in memory, but we don't know where memory's at. But we're not really securing into the story. I'm not sure that we're securing into the biomass, because I see people have wonderful stories about themselves, but are not healthy and really don't demonstrate that level of fitness that would support their story of valor, right? It kind of a fun piece when you look at it. I started teaching, I said, really, we need to start to get a sense of how this thing is working and if it's working okay. So I really need to internalize those feelings. So I started teaching, get a connection to something, secure into something. If you're on a roller coaster ride, you secure into the arm rails, you tighten the seatbelt, you secure into the arm rails, you get in a car, you put the seatbelt on because it's a law, but because also it also keeps you from losing control if you get in an accident. I have been in accidents with seatbelts on, without seatbelts on. I've kind of bounced around inside of cars a couple of times. It's much better being secured, right? Some of you have too. So being able to secure into something is wise. I like to secure into the feeling of something. I feel connected to right now, to the moment right now. I have a feeling of in my body, I can get a sensation of like, I'm well grounded, here I am secured. So that allows me to think in reference of from this point, I can then measure out. It gives me some gradients to play with. Does that all change? Of course it all changes, right? It should, but I can go back and then find a secure place again, someplace different, but I can then use the same pattern to define things relative to where I am right now. And that supports the idea of making a range for you to play within, and then being secure in the center of that range, you can expand it out farther and engulf more things, at least as far as you can. So it gives us this expansion that we can always play with. Maybe that's all it is in the game, is to be able to expand, or what we would call possibilities, right? So if we could then entertain other possibilities, we're now creating other possibilities. We have to be able to expand that out to get there, all right? Another tool that we have is our senses, right? We have 5 senses, right? And so what's really interesting, it appears that the same message, more or less, goes through all those same 5 channels, right? I'm saying that because we have accounts, lots of them, of people like one guy that's a mountain climber and he can't see. So he's got a piercing in his tongue and he wears a light on his head. So when he's climbing, he can look up with a light and it shows edges and stuff. and he opens his mouth, and the piercing will pick up the light reflection, which will give his brain data to know there's a ledge and something to hold on to so he can climb. Weird stuff, right? And there's tons of those stories out there and lots of books, right? That authors, scientists, researchers have done just to kind of answer some of these questions. So what is the difference then between what's the usefulness of having all these different 5 senses? Well, one thing we know is that refresh rate is quicker for eyes than for smell, right? Smell being on the bottom of the list, eyes being on the top of the list, where it comes into the brainstem. So when you're looking at something, you blink your eyes and you look again and you get a second look, right? Its refresh is fast. When you smell something, you smell that, is something burning? You smell that, and you're doing this because you just lost it. It's got a really slow refresh. You're sniffing around a couple times till you pick that scent up again. It's a slower refresh. In other words, they have a different time signature. And because they have a different time signature, they start to meter time out. Now your brain collects them and doesn't give you a report until most of them are collected. But if it's really a long delay, then it'll give you a partial report. So it's like, wow. So all that data flows in. It gives us this sense of timing, of things taking time, just inherently in our sensory data. You gotta remember the brain's in the dark playing this through. So let's kind of go to the brain, all right? So stimulus response is not fast enough, not at all. So we can't really rely on that. But what we have to then do is, this brain obviously starts out being predictive. It needs to predict because the job of the brain is to keep you alive. I don't know if you noticed it, but all your metabolic functions are pretty much run by this brain, right? So if you're going to run a race, you say, well, I got to warm up first. Well, what are you doing? You're predicting where you have to get your metabolic rate to run that race. So you're gearing up, and this thing's calculating what it needs to do, and it's getting it all set up. So when you take off, you don't just drop over dead with a heart attack. It's already going to go up to the roof, and you've got enough sugar coming in to get that glucose going. So you're burning that fuel as kind of a booster like nitro, and everything's going to go. And you probably condition yourself for a while. As you got closer and closer to events, your predictions started getting more and more affirmed. I don't think when you first make the prediction of what's going to happen, I think it's just pretty much just a wild idea. And as stimulus comes in, it adjusts. So number one, it's used to being wrong, and it's used to adjusting. So that's our skill sets. We realize we made a mistake, we can do better. That's where that comes from. We can do better, all right? It conserves, because we'd have to be eating all the time if we're burning so much fuel. So it conserves. We run a race and then we take a break, So it conserves. So you start to see it starts to build a database somewhere in memory. Wherever that memory's at, we don't know, but somewhere in memory it builds a database. So that database, maybe in animals, is called instincts, and humans maybe called intuition. It just means that normally, under normal circumstances, under these conditions, this is what happens. So it's a shortcut. So our brain doesn't burn any calories. We see a situation, we see a car making a turn in front of us up ahead. We know exactly what's going to happen because it's happened before. So we assume it's going to be the same. We might slow down a little bit. We might gain up on them a little bit because they're starting to go slower, but we know they're going to speed up and take off. And of course, if they are car stalls or something, we have to hit our brakes quickly because that's then an unknown, and we have to then adapt for that. After a while, all those variables become part of that whole story. But before that person turned in front of you, you were driving along, talking to your friends or listening to the radio or thinking about the flowers on the center of the roadway. And all that changed in a heartbeat. All that changed really fast. That whole shift, that whole thing totally shifts. You find that data, you've got that stuff going in there. It's extremely, extremely fast because this thing is looking for all the time. it's running unconsciously a whole bunch of patterns, at least 9, research says. So it's running all these parallels, trying to figure all this stuff out to make those predictions for you. Yeah, then later on we make up a story and we say, yeah, I was driving down the road, yeah, and this guy pulled in front of me, yeah, and I hit my brakes on, boy, I saved the day, yeah. But no, it was all a process that's always going on, always going on. Really kind of an interesting thing. So as long as it's consistent pieces, it works really, really good. If the pieces start to get inconsistent, then we have some challenges, because then we really have to stop, take a pause. So on that note, I'm going to stop and take a pause. I'm going to call this the end of the first part, right? And we'll look at starting with part 2, which is how do we start to build confidence in the world? And how do we embrace change that's not part of our expectation? And where do we go with that? How do we build off of that? How do we influence that? And how do we allow it to influence us? So thank you much for tolerating this long part 1. We'll probably do the same thing with part 2. All right, thanks.